Thank you, Bill. Sean, are you with us? Is that happening? Yes? Okay.
Yep.
So Sean, I'm going to turn to you first and ask you the question that I promised I would, which is, to what degree do you think there are significant similarities in your case of Burma with those of North Korea and Cuba, or differences, important differences?
No, it's a very interesting question, Eric, and just listening to Marcus and William then, a couple of things come to mind. The first one, Marcus made a point about North Korea, about in essentially not being in a position to change, not wanting to change. You know, it was a regime that is not for turning, as Margaret Thatcher would have said. And Burma clearly was. And so, you know, my presentation suggested that sanctions played a role, but clearly I think more important were dynamics in Burma itself. And what I think is quite interesting compared to North Korea is that Burma had a succession problem, or the succession wasn't arranged. Whereas, of course, in North Korea, it very, very clearly is. But the old dictator of Burma was needing to step aside. He's getting very old, basically. There's no real system of handing on power. So, in a sense, there was quite a moment, apart from the economic crisis in the country and so on, there was just an interesting difference, I think, with North Korea, that power had to be handed on and to a younger generation, a little bit more internationally minded, a little bit more concerned with the economy and so on. So I think that's perhaps an interesting aspect. The other thing I should just say that the North Korea, of course, is connected to Burma in all sorts of ways, but including the sanctions story, the sanctions that, again, Marcus mentioned on Banco Delta Asia, that had a huge impact on attitudes within Burma's financial system and within the government as well. With respect to Cuba, if I could just make an observation that it seems to me that the big difference, as a frequent visitor to your country there in the US and a frequent visitor to Capitol Hill and the State Department and so on to talk about Burma, one of the things that's always struck me is a great difference between Burma and Cuba is that Burma doesn't matter for domestic politics in the US. And I think that means that the whole interactions in Congress and State Department and so on is very, very different. And in fact, if I may say so, as a visitor, as an outsider to America, I get to see Congress at its very best, where people are really acting upon moral conviction but being very rational about it. There's no real political noise, if you like, and so I've always been very impressed meeting senior officials and people from Congress and so on there about Burma, and I guess it's really just because of that. As I say, Burma just doesn't really matter politically in the US.
That's very interesting. Thank you. So, if you were wondering how you could become an optimist about the American system of government, the answer is to become a Burma specialist.
Indeed.
And an Australian.
Yeah. Marcus, same question?
Well, as I indicated in my opening remarks, I think the primary difference is just the utter closeness of North Korea and the utter lack of a civil society. So you don't have similar sorts of interchange and dynamics in the case of North Korea that you have with Cuba or with Myanmar, either one. I think it's sort of the most extreme case. And as I mentioned, and as Sean has now mentioned, the whole issue of financial sanctions and the role of the U.S. financial system as a leveraging mechanism, I think is highlighted in these two cases. But I think the sad thing about North Korea is that as problematic as human rights may be in Myanmar or Cuba, the truly sad and regrettable thing about North Korea is the almost utter unaccountability of the North Korean regime, and hence its untrammeled ability just to impose misery on its own people in a way that I don't think the government of Cuba can get away with, and I don't think the government of Myanmar can get away with.
So I think one of the things that I've learned in the last 2 days is the extent to which targeted financial sanctions as an instrument seems to be much more effective than the other kinds of instruments. And I think that's even true in the Cuban case. The Cubans today charge a 10% tax on dollars. If you're Cuban and you get remittances in dollars from your family, you turn them into convertible pesos so that you can spend them in the market. You pay not just the sort of normal conversion rate, but you also pay a 10% tax. And that was imposed in order to try to create an incentive for Cuban Americans to send remittances in euros, to avoid this problem of clearing dollars through the international financial system, which was, Cuba was running into this same problem, that banks were not willing to do business with them internationally because they were afraid that if they cleared transactions that were of Cuban origin, that they would run afoul of U.S. sanctions, and a number of them have. There have been a number of cases of banks that have been fined for breaking U.S. financial sanctions, fined for conducting transactions on behalf of Cuba. This has gotten so bad, actually, that it's become an obstacle to the restoration of normal diplomatic relations between the two countries, because no bank in the United States has been willing to allow Cuban diplomats to open checking accounts. And despite the efforts of the State Department to convince them that it's okay, that they won't actually face any sanctions if they do this. But the regulatory burden that the bank has to assume has been such that they can't make any money doing it, and it's just a big headache, and so no one's been willing to do it. So I think even the Cuban case fits into this conclusion that the targeted financial sanctions and the dominance of the United States in the international financial system really is a significant lever in these cases. One of the things that strikes me as similar to the North Korean case is the complexity of the sanctions and the fact that they're governed by all these different rules and regulations and laws. And so, untangling it at the end of the day turns out to be a very, very difficult thing to do, as President Obama is finding in the Cuba case. The big difference with the North Korean case, of course, is the whole issue of legitimacy. Because in the North Korean case, there's pretty broad international legitimacy in favor of the sanctions regime, whereas in the Cuban case, as I said, there was no international legitimacy any longer for the U.S. sanctions regime, and it actually had begun to hurt us. I would just to repeat sort of the three criteria that empirically we found are important for understanding the success or failure of sanctions regimes. Cuba is a small and weak target by and large, but the goal that the United States has had has always been overreaching. That is to say, it was either changing the regime or getting the regime to make fundamental concessions with regard to the core principles of either its foreign policy or, more recently, its domestic political and economic organization. And the regime has never been willing to make those kind of concessions. And then, really, since the 1970s, the United States has never had a broad coalition in support of the sanctions.
Thank you. In listening to these presentations, all extremely informative and to the point, and thank you for that to all the speakers, I'm struck as an observer by the differences more than the similarities, particularly between Burma on the one hand and North Korea and Cuba on the other hand. In the case of Burma, we have what apparently is a successful application of sanctions and one that is taken outside of politics. In the case of the other two, what we have really is a substitute for war. The people, there's an enormous clamor in both cases domestically for military action against both of these countries. Military action is deemed impractical or counterproductive, and so sanctions are put in place instead. And yet, one can imagine, having just gone through Iraq, it's it might be a ridiculous statement to make if that's what you have in your mind. But one can imagine in certain cases that war might actually be preferable, and I'm speaking hypothetically now, to the suffering that is caused by sanctions, because a lot of people die slowly rather than quickly, owing to when you refuse to allow them to have nutrition and medical care and other forms of sanctions. So I guess I'm wondering to what degree, and I'm not asking you to endorse war in either case. That's not my point. But I'm asking all the panelists, to what degree do you think sanctions can be weighed against their moral cost? What kind of sanctions can we justify? See, here's the problem that I'm trying to get at. Sanctions are supposed to change elite behavior, but they strike at the masses. Not the elites can often get around sanctions because they have international connections. So what kind of sanctions, Bill alluded to it, what kind of sanctions are useful in trying to change behavior? Because again, even a powerful nation like the United States against a weak nation like Cuba, there's still a lot of options for Cuba to get, the elites to get what they want. So what kind of sanctions can actually affect elite behavior without imposing an unacceptable moral cost on the population itself? And to what degree do you think our politicians actually even consider that moral cost? Should we go in order? Sean?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Well, I think the Burma story is very consistent with the other two in this context, and it's a very real issue. One of the things I never really made clear in my presentation, I guess, is that, like the other two, the sanctions are extraordinarily complex. But I think, and unwinding them has been a complex thing. But directly to your point, Eric, I think the Burma story is highly relevant. The very first sanctions put in place were essentially the big import ban of Burmese goods into the US, and I think the effects on that were negative in all sorts of ways. But the financial ones that came right at the very end, the very last applied, they're the ones that really hit the elite. So I think it's a great question, and I think Burma was an example of the unfortunate sequence by which the sanctions were put in. I think we may have seen something a little earlier had the financial sanctions gone in first, but then again, maybe the global finance just became a little bit more important by the end of it as well. But no, I think it's a good question. I think, as I say, Burma is consistent with the other two in that context.
Thank you. Marcus, any comment?
Yeah. First of all, war is not an option on the Korean Peninsula. The city of Seoul is as large as New York City. It's pretty much on the border. The North Koreans have 11,000 artillery tubes mounted on the Kaesong range. And the city of Seoul is bisected by the Han River. Basically, the North Koreans could blow out 20 bridges across the Han River and then take target practice at the high rises, and it would be a matter of how quickly our counter-artillery batteries could take out their dug-in positions. So war is not an option. I mean, there's no scale of deprivation that's been suffered by North Korea that would be equivalent to a war on the Korean Peninsula. Secondly, to the extent that North Korea has experienced deprivation, and I have enormous sympathy for the North Korean people and have been deeply involved in this situation for years, the deprivation, sadly, has largely been inflicted by their own regime. This is a country that experienced, it's the only semi-industrial country to ever experience a peacetime famine that killed perhaps 600,000 to 1 million people, or about 3 to 5% of the population. That'd be the equivalent of something killing 10 or 15 million people here in the United States. And that famine was a product of the decisions of the North Korean government, which subsequently hampered relief efforts. Today, to the extent that one believes the estimates produced by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, the grain balance in North Korea could be closed by an absolutely trivial reduction in North Korean military expenditure. We're talking about less than 1% reduction in military expenditure could close the grain balance. So I think it is a real misconception to blame the sufferings of the North Korean people on external sanctions. As I mentioned, at least in the case of the UN sanctions, they are primarily aimed at military transactions. They're aimed at stopping North Korean exports of arms and blocking importation of components of weapons of mass destruction. The punitive sanctions that are on luxury goods are on, in fact, luxury goods and really have a little effect on the general population, if they have any effect at all.
So just to clarify, you have no, and I'm learning, I'm not criticizing, you have no real criticism of the sanctions regime as currently in place.
Let me finish.
Okay.
I think the defensive sanctions against military transactions are wholly justifiable. I think the punitive sanctions on luxury goods are basically a sideshow. I think the one thing that you could have any kind of moral qualms about are the financial sanctions because of the broad disruptive effect on the economy. And I think that is a reasonable argument. The problem is that, and the reason why, to me, North Korea creates such a conundrum, is it is simply so immune to any kind of external pressure of any sort, and inducements as well. It is a regime that really marches to its own drummer, and you can sanction them. It doesn't change behavior on these core political interests. You can provide inducements and rewards. It doesn't change behavior because they're simply not making their decisions based on the considerations or the calculations that we would make, and that's why it is such a difficult case.
How large is that regime? In other words, how stable is it outside of the family itself?
So, in some ways, North Korea, it sort of combines the worst of Stalinism and the worst of the Yi dynasty. It is a dynastic regime that has inherited a fairly articulated set of institutions from Stalinist Soviet Union. So you have the population of North Korea is, say, roughly 24 million people. The Workers' Party has probably got 3 or 4 million members. The core elite is probably 250,000 people, many of whom, like in other Asian communist countries, are related by family relations going back 2 generations to the original founding of the regime. Nobody obviously can predict the future. There was a very good study done by an International Relations Institute in Seoul where they interviewed 135 experts. And I use the term experts advisedly in this context. Former Vice President Mondale once told me, anybody who tells you they're an expert on North Korea is a liar or a fool. And so I was not one of the, quote, experts consulted in this study. But 135 multilateral experts, multinational experts, a range of opinions. But the kind of consensus opinion is the life expectancy of this regime is probably 10 to 20 years. It will ultimately fall due to intra-elite conflict with the ultimate denouement being unification with the South.
Okay. Bill?
So I think you're exactly right about the moral problem of particularly the kind of broad sanctions that historically have been in place against Cuba. I mean, when the Cuban Democracy Act reimposed the ban on subsidiary trade, as I said, it was about $700 million worth of food and medicine trade that was cut off at a time when Cuba was in the midst of trying to reorient all its trade relations because of the collapse of Eastern European and Soviet communism, and it had a severe impact on the Cuban healthcare system, and on people's daily lives. Similarly, when George W. Bush put restrictions on remittances to Cuba, remittances are a very important component of people's standard of living, and when remittances are constrained, people's standard of living goes down. So those were real costs to ordinary people, and they were not enough to get a change in regime behavior. They just inflicted pain and punishment on people. And I have to say, I think that at certain moments in U.S. history, that's actually been the objective. It's just to punish Cuba for having been defiant for such a long time. Pope John Paul II.
Don't you think that people, sorry to interrupt, but don't you think that some of these people are thinking that, as they thought with the Bay of Pigs, that the Cubans will rise up because they see that they'll see the cost of their mistake, and that will change regime behavior rather than the regime changing its own behavior?
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I mean, there have been people in the U.S. government making that argument since 1959, literally, and it's 54 years later, and it's never worked out. In terms of what sanctions work, I think that the strategy Obama has today with Cuba is a strategy of engagement rather than one of sanctions, and it's aimed at reinforcing existing domestic political and economic dynamics that are unfolding. And I think that's what makes it different in some ways and more likely to be successful than the failure of inducements in the North Korean case, for example. Because there you're trying to induce the regime to do something it just doesn't want to do. Whereas in the Cuban case, there are certain dynamics unfolding in Cuba now as it tries to move away from the sort of hyper-centralized Soviet model of planning towards a more market socialism. And the United States is trying to influence that trajectory of change, if you will, through a policy of engagement. We'll see whether that's effective or not, but I think at least conceptually it makes a lot more sense than either the sanctions regime or trying to offer inducements for a regime that doesn't want to change.
Thank you. I'd like to give people in the audience an opportunity to speak, ask questions. We have microphones. Maybe you don't need them, but you're welcome to them on either side. So say hello, please. Yeah?
There's always the aspect of the great game. There's elephant in the room, might be China, might be Soviet Russia. But I think it's also important really to prioritize human rights in our foreign policy, hopefully. And with Burma, yes, it's true that Congress has come together in a bipartisan way to, at least in the House, to pass a resolution rather quickly last year on Burma. Senate has yet to do this, partly because Senator Menendez is embroiled in a corruption inquiry and hasn't been reintroduced. But yet, to scold Mr. Turnell for a moment, you used the phrase communal violence, which is a very equal kind of sounding conflict wherein, in fact, the persecution of some groups like the Rohingya are very one-sided and include generations of statelessness, of restrictions on free movement in the country, intermarriage, loss of millions of acres of property, and massive dislocation. So this sort of level of persecution is certainly something that we've got to keep front and center as a moral concern. I see that in engaging with the government of Burma, the U.S. seems to be under the illusion that free markets lead to a free society or an open society, and that doesn't seem to always be the case. So in terms of alternate strategies to sanctions, CSR, corporate responsibility, social responsibility, is that just a joke? Is that possible? Are there other alternatives that you see? Because obviously, to me, it seems we've lost leverage since we've lost the sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you. Sean?
I completely agree. Just on the issue of communal violence, it was a label I used, and I agree it's not sufficient. I completely agree about the one-sided nature of what it is there. I was grasping for a term, basically. But look, I also completely agree about the lack of leverage. I think this is the problem. One of the things we haven't addressed, of course, because it wasn't really on the topic, was to talk about the outcome in Burma. I mean, there's been a certain degree of political change, but I'm out there very much as a critic of what's happened and what hasn't happened. I think sanctions played a role at triggering a response amongst the Burmese regime. I think a separate question would be, we're now 2 years into a process about where that has actually gone, the extent that it's real. I alluded to the issue of the elections that are coming up in 2015, which almost certainly won't be free and fair, but which are likely to be declared free and fair by the Obama administration. So I think there has been as you said, a loss of leverage. My sort of hope on that front is, as I said, that if things were to go even worse than one might be expecting, then there is a certain degree of leverage from the fact that some of the financial sanctions and other sanctions, in fact, are just suspended rather than completely lifted. But I think it's true. I think the international community has been far too optimistic about what's happened there. I think the Burmese regime has been extraordinarily successful. The advice that they're getting about playing the international community, I think, has been a part of that, and I'm sure you would be aware of the recent news about the signing up of the Podesta group, etc., to essentially lobby Congress and other players over there. So I guess I mostly agree with your assessment. I think there's a difference between, as I say, a question about whether sanctions were part of a story delivering change, and a separate question entirely about the meaning of that change. And I think on that front, as I say, I wouldn't disagree with what you've said.
Thank you.
My name is Marian Lipschitz. I'm just here as an individual citizen.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. And I'm also a member of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. I think human rights issues are very important. My questions are for Marcus Noland. I saw a very poignant documentary on Frontline about North Korea, and in part it focused on people who escaped, who are now residents of South Korea, and what some of them are doing. They gathered periodically near the border, and they catapult DVDs of movies, popular culture, things that they feel will maybe in some sectors of the population open up the idea that another alternative, another kind of life is possible. So I'm wondering, in your prediction about how long the current regime is going to exist, how that is going to factor in, because they also were able to film some of the people in the small, better off elite who seemed restless about the status quo and who had a little bit more access to the outside world. And the second question that I have is that I also take that last slide that you showed seriously. I don't think it's a joke that Eric Schmidt and that Mark and that Mr. Rodman thought it was, whatever they thought it was, amusing, profitable to engage in that way with the government of North Korea. And I thought about the contrast with Cuba, where it wasn't effective to have the travel ban. So I'm interested if you could flesh out why they were able to go in the first place and what kind of policies the United States has in terms of who can go to North Korea and why.
Thank you.
Okay, those are really interesting questions, and I'll try to be brief. There are now about 25,000 North Korean refugees resident in South Korea. It's now a large enough group of people that these various groups that you mentioned are fairly differentiated. You actually have women who got tired of being pushed around by the men, so you've kind of got a feminist group. You've got a group that's made up of former officers in the North Korean army, and so on and so forth. They have been trying to get these materials into North Korea for quite a while. I was initially skeptical. I read some of the tracts they had written, and I was surprised by the political sophistication. I thought it would be much more kind of just crude propaganda. And then, of course, they're trying to get popular culture in. The big thing right now is this sort of mini controversy about them trying to balloon in copies on flash drives or DVD of the interview. And you'll remember I have flashed a commercial for my blog at the very end of my presentation. I actually have an entire blog post within the last 10 days or so devoted to this issue of these guys all trying to get the interview and other products into North Korea. I think we're in for a long game, and I think there's a kind of inside track, which is through the UN and things like the Commission of Inquiry and the hearing that was held yesterday that ended up in apparently a near riot. But I think there's also a role for actions that do not require the cooperation or acquiescence of the North Korean regime. So I would like to see increased funding for Radio Free Asia and other ways of trying to get information to the North Korean people. I would start with news you can use. Send them weather reports. For example, North Korean fishermen prefer South Korean weather reports to North Korean weather reports because they're higher quality. Send them, I grew up in a rural area. Send them the crop report. Tell the farmers what the prices are for these various commodities they're growing in different locations. Help them get a leg up. And then once they get used to listening to your broadcast for news you can use, then you can read them Eric's blog or the New York Times or something for broader sorts of news. On the issue of who can go to North Korea, anybody can go to North Korea. There is a travel advisory. The State Department doesn't think it's a real good idea for pretty clear reasons. And frankly, the problem for most people is they've arranged to go to North Korea. They have traveled to Beijing, and then once they get to Beijing, the North Korean embassy won't issue them a visa. So that's the problem. The issue with Schmidt, he got in there basically, I don't know what his particular motivation was. He was in there with former UN Secretary and Governor Bill Richardson, who has his own agenda with respect to North Korea. Dennis Rodman, and if you'll just grant me a minute, because this really isn't actually an interesting story, I probably shouldn't tell, but enough time has elapsed, I think it probably is okay. I was brought in to brief President Obama on these sorts of issues we're discussing this morning. And he was asking me a lot about why the Chinese were unenthusiastic about sanctions and so on. And then we got to the point of the conversation, and I was much more polite than I'm going to be now. And I said, Mr. President, the six-party talks are dead in the water. And in the spirit of Secretary Perry, we have to deal with North Korea as it is, not how we want it to be. And this was at a moment in which no American had actually met Kim Jong-un. And I said, look, if this guy is really as obsessed with the 1990s Chicago Bulls as he appears to be, then let's work with it. And Obama was sitting there with two aides on either side of him. I said, you send Danny and Sid to North Korea. And I had a candidate, Steve Kerr. And I won't go into the reasons why I have some connections to Steve Kerr. But his father was at one point the chairman of the Department of Political Science at UCLA. He and his brother John grew up partly in Beirut, partly in Cairo. If there was anybody who had kind of a broader vision of the world on those Chicago Bulls teams, it was Steve Kerr. I said, send these guys to Pyongyang with Steve Kerr. If the North Koreans want to talk Turkey, well, you got your aides there. If he just wants to play one-on-one or shoot horse with Steve Kerr, well, then at least your guys get to meet him and they get to look around and see what happens. The two aides are literally turning white because they're very much by the book. We got a playbook and we're going to run this play. And I told my father later, I said, if the president literally didn't turn to them when he walked out of that room and gave them a direct order to do it, it would never happen. A couple months later, we got Dennis Rodman. He wanted to meet Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan, for understandable reasons, refused. Scottie Pippen wouldn't go. And so they reached out through the UN mission here. Dennis Rodman was living in northern New Jersey. Somebody knew him. Rodman was broke. He needed the money and the publicity. And so, politics abhors a vacuum. Instead of having a chaperone visit by Steve Kerr, you've got an unchaperoned visit by a drunk.
So has Dennis Rodman reported back to anyone in the Obama administration?
Oh yeah, the CIA debriefed Dennis Rodman. I really wished I would have been there for that one. But Rodman's, Rodman, he visited, there's actually, if you want to talk to somebody, there's a professor at Columbia University named Joe Terwilliger, who accompanied Rodman on that first trip, and he would actually be a better source of the stories of Dennis Rodman's diplomacy than I would.
Never thought you'd say those words. Over
you.
here, thank you.
Thank you. I also have a question for Mr. Noland. I have two questions which are ultimately interrelated. The first is, what are the interests of the elite at this time? And what I mean specifically is it to only maintain power and the current regime, or is there somewhere some sincerity to achieve socialism and fulfill their Juche philosophy? That's question one. Number two is I'm aware of the advancement of the official, quote unquote, official markets and the grasshopper markets. And I've actually read your book on the markets in the DPRK. And I want to ask you, what is the current status of the markets and how do they continue to affect elite decisions, especially in relation to question one?
Okay, those are really good and subtle questions, and in the interest of time, the fact there are two other countries, I'll really try to be brief. In terms of motivation, look, self-preservation is their motivation. If North Korea ceases to become, their status and their wealth is directly connected to North Korea's existence as a sovereign independent state. If it unifies with South Korea, there is not going to be a role for most of these people. So they have an enormous stake in maintaining North Korea as a sovereign state. Beyond that, do they sincerely want to build socialism or Juche? My training is in economics, not psychiatry, so I don't know what the motivations at that level. I can tell you that I think the trajectory that North Korea is on is towards a repressive, opaque kleptocracy based on the extraction of natural resources, sort of like what you see in some of the worst Central Asian states. I mean, that's kind of the trajectory they're on. Now, in terms of the market, the state has always had an ambivalent reaction to the market. The state, if I were to characterize North Korean attitudes, North Korean elite or leadership attitudes towards the economy, it's we want to be modern. They want to have cell phones. They want to have sort of the accoutrements of modernity. We want to be prosperous. We want it on our own terms. And so, for example, they want economic integration with China, but they don't want this kind of decentralized, market-conforming, profit-seeking stuff that has developed over the last 15 years. What they want is channels of integration that are tightly controlled by the center. And so the state has an ambivalent attitude towards the market. It sort of tolerates it as a safety valve, but it's fundamentally uncomfortable with it because in a literal and metaphorical sense, the market is emerged as this kind of semi-autonomous zone of social communication and potentially political organizing. Because all those consumer goods sold in the market come from China. And because the Chinese don't trust the North Koreans, it's basically all cash transactions, which means that somebody literally has to go to Dandong and collect the goods and then bring them back. So that supply chain that runs up the western coast of the country, that supply chain is not only bringing television sets and shoes and warm coats, it's bringing information about the outside world. I think this is a true statement. If you got all your news and information from KCNA, you would think Hosni Mubarak was president of Egypt. You would think Muammar Gaddafi was still running Libya, and you wouldn't realize there was any unpleasantness in Syria. But of course, if you ask, well, what are people in the market talking about? They're talking about ISIS. Where do they get their information? They get it largely by word of mouth coming through China, through the market, and that's why the state is uncomfortable with this phenomenon.
Thank you. Final words, observations, thoughts? Anyone? Sean?
No, other than, I guess just to reiterate that where I think sanctions have played a role as well as some of the other things is changing the behaviour of the Burmese regime in terms of how it interacts with the world, what it presents, etc., as well as a subtle story of divisions within the governing apparatus there about that some genuinely do want change and some don't. But I think a very separate question, which maybe for another conference, would be whether sanctions can bring about real change as opposed to the presentation of change in order to relieve the pressure. So, as I say, I think all of that is a very much bigger dimension which involves perhaps more depth on the individual countries concerned.
Thank you, Sean. Speaking personally, Sean, you increased my knowledge of the effectiveness of sanctions against Burma by an infinite %. So it was a very interesting presentation. Thank you. Marcus?
One of the things I'm struck by is in South Korea, where politics are very polarized, the right has no trouble talking about human rights in North Korea because it follows a traditional anti-communist narrative. The left has no coherent stance on North Korean human rights. And I was reminded of something yesterday with the discussion of South Africa and the mention of the Sullivan Principles and voluntary labor codes, which ultimately proved inadequate there. I've been urging my South Korean friends on the progressive side to embrace things of that sort as a progressive response to the North Korean human rights conundrum. If we're going to invest in North Korea, if we're going to employ North Koreans, let's at least treat them decently. And let's try to use, if we're going to get in, and in the spirit of Eric's question about the moral culpability of sanctions, if we're going to engage, let's make sure we engage in a way that actually promotes human rights and human dignity.
Right. And let's not take any lessons from NYU about how to do that. Bill?
I think one of the differences in the Cuban case from these other two is the strong domestic political component, which one of the questioners mentioned earlier. Really, at least since the end of the Cold War, no president has looked at sanctions against Cuba without thinking about politics in Miami and what it will mean in the next presidential election. And certainly for President Clinton and even for President Obama, that's been a significant calculation. And I think one of the explanations for why sanctions lasted as long as they did, way past, as Obama said, way past their expiration date, was precisely this domestic political obstacle. And one of the reasons that the sanctions are finally gradually being lifted is precisely because the politics in Miami have begun to change. With newer arrivals, younger Cuban Americans born in the United States now constituting almost half the Cuban American electorate, attitudes in Miami are much more moderate, and you can see it in opinion polls, and you can see it in the last presidential election when Obama got half the Cuban American vote running on a moderate policy towards Cuba. So that domestic political obstacle has really diminished pretty dramatically at the same time when, as I mentioned earlier, the diplomatic cost of maintaining the status quo was going up. And I think those two cost curves crossed at some point, and Obama decided it made sense to normalize relations.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'd specifically like to thank the organizers of this conference for all the hard work they put in making it possible. I'd obviously like to thank our three excellent panelists for very illuminating presentations. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here and helping us work through some of these issues. So thanks for coming, and stay for more, and goodbye.